In this video, I want to talk a bit about the experience of psychotic depression and how you can perhaps identify yourself or how those around you can potentially identify that you're experiencing psychotic depression and might be in need of some temporary supports. So, for me, some of the signs that I was experiencing psychotic depression or that had started to develop in the past is that I showed several features of depression. So, I wasn't very sad per se. It was absolutely not the case that I was crying nonstop or that I felt super low in mood in terms of needing to cry, etc. What I did notice was that I was extremely low in energy. So I would really struggle to get out of bed for extended periods of time. During the day, I would really struggle to focus, struggle to pay attention for longer than a few minutes. I really started struggling reading books, something that I always really enjoyed doing. And that all of a sudden, or maybe not all of a sudden, but that gradually started to feel very difficult. And I didn't have the focus to became quite cynical and quite negative in many ways. So we no longer seeing the positive in people, which I usually do, but more focusing on people's shortcomings, things that are difficult, etc., etc. Then from the psychotic side of things, I really started to vicious and quite withdrawn. So I became a bit less social. Usually, I'm a very social person, really value my friends, hanging out with friends and family. Um, Periods where that psychotic depression was developing and where that took hold, I was inclined to interact less with my friends. I became quite suspicious, and so gradually the belief started taking hold that I was the subject of an international police operation that kind of gradually started to develop with initially thinking I'm a bad employee, I'm a PhD student, I am a terrible mother, and there really were not any reasons to think that. So there were very small things that happened. Like my kids, I remember they had shoes with shoes. They were quite dirty. They had some holes in them. But my kids at that time were maybe around 7, 8 years old. And so they would play outside with their shoes, and these were just their old shoes. But I took that as an indication that I was a bad mother and that I didn't give them the attention and the material resources that they deserved. Well, actually, this is a very common thing. Kids have shoes, shoes get dirty, shoes get old. So, really kind of taking those things out of context, taking them out of proportion, and feeling incredibly guilty and incredibly about very normal things. I'm ashamed of myself, very ashamed that I couldn't keep up with everything and realized a lot of the negative kind of external feedback that I got, for example, within the quite competitive academic world, partly within where there is still a lot of differences, right, in how people decide to parent and to live their life. And if you're choosing the option of working as well as parenting as a woman, it's still difficult because you obviously can't live up to the standards that a mother to live up to if she's a full-time without outside the house. Confused in this period that my psychotic depression was developing, I kind of noticed that I wasn't feeling super well, that I was feeling quite down, quite low, quite tired. I didn't connected with my family and friends, but I exactly put my finger on what was happening. And I also didn't realize at that point in time, as is inherent in psychosis, that thoughts about not being good enough, about being, etc. They're not entirely rational or not rational at all in some cases. Husband at the time, it was also very confusing because he could very clearly see I wasn't doing well. Um, didn't really grasp the seriousness of what was developing, what was going on. He probably also just didn't know what to do, what was happening to me. And I think in general, it was quite obvious that I wasn't doing great, but I think nobody was developing serious depression or that I was developing psychotic symptoms until they were really extreme and until I really experienced some hallucinations and some clear delusions. So hallucinations I only experienced particular time period. So one particular when it was really at its worst. And the hallucinations that I experienced were mainly related to the TV. So shows in the TV and nothing coherent, but just things that kind of when I think back, that probably kind of visually weren't really there, were clearly around that police operation and kind of being a terrible employee. It's still difficult to this day for me to think back to that period, and I still find it quite tiring, for example, to talk about this, to make a video like this. It was really a very traumatic experience, and it took me a time to recover from this experience. So, yeah, experience of the psychosis itself, but then also the experience of being hospitalized under a mental health order. So, not our will. Um, that was, but also a very traumatic experience. And I think there's a lot that can still be enhanced in those or in kind of hospitalization of people who are mentally unwell and how they are treated. Um, Aftermath of my hospitalization and kind of me becoming really unwell, I think it took me a long time to recover, primarily because of shock, because of anxiety, uh, depression, well, partly because of misdiagnosis initially. So I was initially diagnosed with stress-induced psychosis and prescribed antipsychotics, but no antidepressants. For a couple of weeks, seeing a different psychiatrist, they revised that diagnosis and prescribed depressants as the primary medication. Wrote. So to overcome that depression really took several months, and I was on sick leave for months, and it was really a lot to process, a lot to make sense of. Challenging, difficult journey that I will tell a bit more about in another video. The reason why I'm sharing this is not because I necessarily like telling my story, but because I felt quite isolated in the period that led up to me becoming unwell, in the period that I was really unwell, and in the period recovering again. I only felt negative and quite hopeless that I could fully recover for a while. And that's kind of due to stigma that kind of health professionals communicate, as well as stigma in the community and the society, as well as internalized stigma. Um, After reading a journal article by a UK psychiatrist who had experienced stressing himself and who had recovered and who was kind of writing about the fears he had around his recovery, but also around the impact that this might have on his job as a psychiatrist with the NHS. And a lot of things resonated with me in terms of career, me being a psychologist, how would this impact my career? How would it impact registration? How would I recover? Would this happen again? And so one of the reasons why I want to make these videos to kind of other people who might go through an experience like this and to let you know that you're not alone and that kind of it is possible to either recover or manage an illness like this, right? However that might look, but it's not the case that you will always need to remain in an active psychotic psychotic event, big impactful experience, especially for the person going through this, but also for those around them. And mind to yourself, right? Take your time to process this. Look after yourself, look after your loved ones. If the people around the person who has experienced psychotic depression, and try to remain hopeful, right? My life these days is very much like the life of everyone else. I work full time, I have two kids, I have good friends, sheep, etc., etc., right? No lingering psychotic symptoms, no lingering depressive symptoms. Just need to manage my trip reasonably. Anything that reminds me of that period, I really need to be very mindful to look after myself. And that has a big impact on how I feel and on my energy levels. And I hope you would do the same for yourself, looking after yourself.